On August 1st, 2024, this freshly freed Russian spy stepped off a plane in Moscow. But his expression wasn't one of joy. In fact, he looked strangely somber for somebody who just got their freedom. Finally free after 2 years of imprisonment, one would expect him to be ecstatic to touch down in Moscow and be greeted by the president. However, unlike other Russian spies coming home to freedom and family, this man's future may not be filled with praise and medals. My name is Christo Grozev and I specialize in investigating Russian espionage, influence operations and disinformation. On August 1st, 2024, a massive prisoner swap took place between Russia and the West. It was the largest multilateral prisoner swap since the Cold War, involving 24 people in total. 16 were released back to the West. Some were high-profile Americans wrongly imprisoned, like the 32-year-old Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. Others were famous Russian dissidents who had dared to oppose Putin's regime and will now have to live in exile. On the other side, 8 Russian prisoners were returned to Moscow. Among them was an assassin, multiple spies, and several convicted hackers and criminals. Now, my team's reporting over the years is actually what put several of these Russian characters in prison in the first place. So I thought I would tell you a bit more about them and how they came to be involved in this momentous swap. Now let's dive into the case of Mikhail Mikushin, the fake Brazilian professor who got arrested in Norway. In 1978, Mikhail Mikushin was born in the Soviet Union, in modern-day Yekaterinburg. But to his friends and colleagues over the last 2 decades, he was known under a different name, José Assis Giamaria. A false identity that was meticulously crafted by the GRU over 40 years ago. In a little town in Brazil in the early 1980s, Soviet spies managed to alter the local birth records. They inserted a newborn baby, one that had never been born, by finding 2 witnesses who agreed to testify they had seen the birth of the baby at home. A trick used by the Soviet-era GRU to create so-called shelf people, fake identities that would be taken off the shelf as needed many decades later. Our Russian spy, Mikhail Mikushin, was given exactly this fake identity when he was recruited by the GRU in the mid-2000s. In 2011, pretending to be Giamaria and having received a fresh Brazilian passport, Mikushin moved to Canada. He was there to study international relations. In 2019, having graduated, he even published an article on Canada's strategic interest in the Arctic region, a particular area of interest to the Russians who were trying to dominate the area. He tried to integrate himself into Canadian society. He even volunteered for a political party, the New Democratic Party. By 2021, he had moved to Norway, taking the role of a guest postgraduate researcher at the University of Tromsø, focusing on hybrid threats and national security. But behind this wall of academic prowess hid an operative with less than stellar discipline. It turns out that over 20 years of living a fake life, he had been leaving breadcrumbs along the way. His colleagues at Tromsø University noticed that he avoided speaking Portuguese, even though he claimed to be Brazilian. He even asked for a translator from English and not from Portuguese during his court proceedings. I tracked his university email, which had metadata that led to numerous other accounts. Among these were ICQ and LiveJournal, 2 platforms that are commonly used in Russia and nowhere else these days. One of these email accounts used his real name, Mikhail. Another one had as a password that had been leaked his last name, Mikushin, which had been spelled as Mikushin. So how did he get caught? While living in Canada, Mikushin made one crucial blunder. His handler at the time was the military attaché at the Russian embassy. In a moment of panic, Mikushin frantically called his handler. He used a SIM card that was a burner, but he made a mistake of inserting it into his personal phone. The military attaché's phone, in turn, was tracked by Western intelligence services, and it was due to that phone call that Mikushin came onto their radar. From this point forward, Western intelligence services kept surveilling Mikushin, and they tipped off the Norwegians when he moved there. They continued their surveillance over him over the next years, finding even more activities that heightened their suspicion. Mikushin volunteered to participate in a seminar in Lithuania, funded by the EU, that focused on hybrid threats. One session there focused on geopolitical consequences on hypothetical scenarios of sabotage of a gas pipeline, very similar to what happened to Nord Stream later that year. On October 24th that year, while en route to his university in the morning, He was arrested by officers of local intelligence services and taken into custody. Initially, Mikushin was charged with documentary fraud and entering Norway under false pretenses. However, I very soon publicly identified him as a senior member of Russia's GRU illegals program. With that public revelation, the gravity of the accusations against him grew significantly. He was held in custody for nearly 2 years before being included in this historic prisoner swap. There is one key difference between Mikushin and the other arrested Russian illegals. He confessed. A confession that might be seen by his superiors as a betrayal of his country. One that might have catastrophic personal consequences in a country like Russia. It undermines the Kremlin in 3 key ways. First, Russia claimed Mikushin was not a Russian citizen and his Brazilian identity was the real one. Second, sometimes despite an arrest, there isn't enough hard evidence to prove it in court, and the spies can go back freely to Russia. This saves Russia from having to release political prisoners to get their spies back. One more confession means one more political prisoner sacrificed. Finally, all spies go through years of interrogation and torture training, which means that his confession might have been voluntary. He might have wanted to engage in a negotiation with the Norwegians, which would not have been liked by the Kremlin. One could imagine that he might not be too eager to return to his home country after that. Currently, his whereabouts and safety are unconfirmed after his return to Russia. Like other operatives that have been punished for their failures in the past, he risks disappearing suddenly and brutally.